Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again. Wanted to make a video, bit overdue at this point, talking about Necropolis League, what happened with it, what it was, like kind of a post-mortem about it, after the fact. It's kind of dead at the moment, most of us have moved on, and we had a bit of fun with it for sure. There was some good stuff, there was some bad stuff, and I wanted to just go over like my point of view as to how I think the mechanic went down, interacted, like the design choices behind it from how I see it. So yeah, with that, let me just jump straight in to the game. Path of Exile, here we are, Necropolis League. So the entire mechanic itself was centered around this corpse stuff, this graveyard, the Necropolis, and Undertaker Aramor. It was basically split into two parts. One which was kind of just a mapping thing, so every single zone you'd go into and map you would open, you would have some kind of interaction with the map itself, with the monsters, and hopefully sometimes get lucky with some cool shit, and then for the most part unlucky and try and balance it out yourself in a sort of finicky way to make it tolerable. So there was the mapping portion, and then there was the crafting portion. And the crafting portion was through killing stuff and then getting corpses from the stuff that you kill. There would be like some corpses that spawn. You collect some of those corpses, and what happens in the end, you use those corpses to craft an item. So it was still much like every other mechanic at its core, crafting based system, to give you fat loot, to give you extra power than previously before, and in many of these cases it's temporary power. It's something you get during the league that can make your characters stronger, that probably won't make it to the main league. So two very separate systems. And yeah, let me just start with, so there's going to be pros and cons. Let me just start with the good stuff about it. The mapping system was pretty fun. Like opening your map and then seeing what you get with it. And it's kind of like a slot machine lottery thing almost every single time. Seeing what you get, sometimes you get some good stuff, and it could be very game changing. You could get some like really fat loot, lots of chaos orbs. You could build entire atlas trees and strategies around this sort of stuff. The real lucky hits with the divine orbs, so big divine actions sometimes. It was very RNG based, and you'd be pretty lucky to come across the best stuff more than a few times throughout the league. So that's a bit of a downside, but yes, there was some potential there. And for me personally, it was very engaging. Like, it made mapping quite a bit more enticing, especially in the end game. I probably sat around on most characters a bit longer than I normally would because I wanted to do some more maps and I wanted to try and pull some good stuff from the mobs and from the map rolls. So that was potentially seen as a win. And then the other thing is the crafting. Some of the crafting that came out of this generated some really powerful items. Like, we are talking some of the most broken items the game has ever seen. We're talking multiple fractures. We're talking just guaranteed or almost guaranteed hits of some absolutely busted items. Not sure this character has the best examples of it, but you could fairly reliably make and basically print near mirror tier items on the regular. It was just a convoluted system to go through. So I'd say those are the pros, basically, the good stuff. Like, the mapping can potentially be fun, and I'd say for me, it was engaging. And then the crafting can potentially be fun and also can be sort of powerful and engaging. So in the end, just to kind of sum up that, the league was kind of fun and fine for a while. It just wore you down after a while with all of the stuff that goes with it, all the bad stuff. So if you logged in and you played the league and you tried to min-max and you did some cool shit, you probably had a good few weeks of proper solid fun. But it was kind of a burn fast and die young sort of league because there's a lot of tedium that came with it, and there's only so much of some of these things that you can take that in the end everyone pretty much just quit and left. So let's get over let's go over just some of the stuff that kind of maybe went wrong. To begin with, it was a forced league mechanic. Not too many league mechanics out there are forced. We are talking, for the most part, you get to choose whether or not you interact with the league when we have the league up and running. You decide whether or not you like the league, whether or not you can be fucked going into it, and you can avoid it if you really don't like it. And then the rest of the game can be pretty damn good for you, right? Because usually Path of Exile is in a pretty good state. And that means that you can have a lot of fun with Path of Exile without the League, even during the new League. This one is one of very few that has been forced, and I guess it might be kind of an experiment to see, you know, how this shit can go down, and whether or not a proper forcing of a League is the way to go. But basically, you could not enter a map without interacting with this sort of shit, and your maps by default were getting more challenging, at least in some manner, because of these types of modifiers. Sometimes you get some good stuff. It's not too common that you get some really good stuff, but sometimes you would get some pretty damn bad stuff. Even when going through the campaign, you'd run across several things that were pretty annoying, and if you're on hardcore in particular, there's stuff that you actually really have to watch out for. So you can't just like auto roll, set and play and forget, because some mobs having extra bad modifiers could be the absolute death of you. Some of these mods were actually really punishing as well. So you could have like 90% chance to evade, and you're a hit-based character, and you're just wondering why you can't hit something, especially if it's a really tough monster. It was kind of the arch nemesis of a League mechanic, because it was forced on you, and some of it made things quite a bit tougher. And you got to remember, we're not all veteran players that have cracked as fuck meta builds. A lot of the time, someone might just be struggling through the game and already dying enough, and then all of a sudden this League mechanic shows up where some mobs are way tankier or hit way harder, and all of a sudden you're dying way more than before, and you just fucking... you can't do anything about it. You can't skip it. So that's kind of weird. So the force League mechanic thing was a weird one. And then on top of that, the other thing with that is to actually make it rewarding, or not even as punishing, you actually have to spec into it on your atlas. Now that's a bit of a big mistake as well, especially considering the good things for this League mechanic were all over your tree. They were strategically positioned in all different positions, so that you can kind of specialize in different forms for the League mechanic. But if you wanted to actually engage with the League mechanic, you pretty much wanted all of them. So you did have to spec all the fuck over the place, and you pretty much had to spec into it to make this League mechanic worthwhile. If you didn't spec into any of this stuff, you would most of the time just be getting bad modifiers for the good, reward stuff, and you wouldn't really get enough corpses for things that you wanted to try and craft. So that was a bit of a mistake as well, I think. Once again, I think that's an experiment, putting the League mechanic onto the Atlas tree immediately so that people can engage with it, buff it as they want. But it's a fresh new thing. Everyone wants to engage with the fresh new thing. So of course everyone's going to want to spec into it, right? So that feels like a bit of a mistake. You, as previously, introduce a League mechanic, have it be particularly good or, not so good, and then get buffed throughout the League to a point where it's fun and engaging, and then we play with it, and then have it assimilated into Atlas tree later on and figured out what it needs to become, balanced enough with everything else. So I think that was a bit of a mistake as well. So those are two things that are a bit rough for the beginning and for what the League mechanic lacked. One other thing that I'll also mention that's pretty immediately apparent is delayed gratification. So with many leagues, what you're doing is you are immediately running in, killing shit, getting stuff. Instant gratification, right? With some league mechanics, there's not many that this happens in. You kill stuff, something happens, maybe some sort of currency or something you're supposed to use later gets given, and then you use it later and then get the reward from the league mechanic much later. Expedition was a very good example of this. It was not very popular to begin with at all, because people were like, oh, the stuff's tougher. Like, Expedition had its own problems for the patch as well, but the league mechanic itself, mobs were tough and you'd kill stuff and you wouldn't get much out of it, and people were like, oh, this is bullshit. But what was good about it was the stuff that happened after. You'd engage with Expedition currency and logbooks, and all of a sudden you could tailor your gameplay to how you kind of wanted it based off of the Expedition dudes you were trying to encounter and do. And it was very rewarding in the end. It's just, it was delayed gratification. Once we all learned that, once we interacted with it, Expedition's still one of the best mechanics out there for actual reward. It just comes later. This one is very similar in that you can get some immediate reward, but it is pretty RNG. Once again, pop some maps, and maybe you get lucky. not even open yet, is it? Maybe you get lucky, maybe you get some good shit, maybe you don't. So there could be some instant reward by all means. But the biggest draw of this entire mechanic was the crafting in the end. And that is complete delayed gratification. We're talking very delayed as well, because you need a lot of corpses. You need to figure out how to actually craft this shit. Maybe you watch someone else do it. Maybe you have some trial and error. And then you need to save up a lot of this corpse stuff for days and days before you're finally ready to kind of craft your own one big item. And that is very delayed indeed. So it's hard to see the fruits of your labor until much later on. So that seemed like a bit of a problem because people like instant gratification in these types of games, or in this game, I suppose, and in their league mechanics especially. You compare it to a very popular league mechanic and stuff, Last League, where people really, I think it was Last League, Ancestral League, whatever. People really liked leveling characters. They really liked the league mechanic that was giving you the reward because it was ascendancies. Like, that was one of the core reward structures that you got early on. You got to pick like an extra bonus side ascendancy at like level 15 or something. And that usually meant you could have some movement speed from not having sockets on your boots, or some life, or some resist, that sort of shit. And then slowly power up, getting other different league mechanics and stuff as well. So that actually felt really good. And I think that was an immediate power surge that people liked to engage in as a league mechanic and as leveling new characters. The mechanic itself, Trial of the Ancestors, maybe some people liked it, maybe some didn't, whatever. I'm talking about some reward structure, and that is what feels good. Whereas with this one, you didn't really feel rewarded almost ever until you actually went deep into the system. And of course, that will bring us to the next point of the actual crafting mechanic. And yeah. Well, as you can see, one of the big problems that we all tried to overcome is the corpse situation. Knowing what we know now, I'm going to be a bit harsh and critical of this because I don't know, I feel like it these days. Knowing what we know now about the mechanic and how it is and how you've interacted with it and what it takes to make good stuff, the way it was actually put up on launch is pretty fucking abysmal, isn't it? Just throw it in a trash can. Like, how was that actually shipped to us as the crafting mechanic the way it was on day one? Like, we are talking way less of all these numbers of making things more likely, of making things scarcer. We are talking, I think they wanted like fucking 16 corpses in your thing to begin with. And yeah, just like the actual practicality of crafting a real item from that shit was not good on day one. And I think the problem with that I can identify anyway is it was a bit too much thought about the theme of the league and like how it would present as opposed to the practicality of it. Because it's like this corpse theme. You're supposed to be interacting with this guy who grabs the corpse from the thing that you're killing, and then he like takes it away, and you know, you're crafting through the corpses of these enemies. And then there's this entire morgue thing which has all these guys, you know, kind of like lined up, and you're interacting with the power of the corpse of the thing to grant you extra power and stuff. Like, it's the theme of it, but in practice, like, you're not going to have fucking 1,000 corpses sitting around here. You don't really care about the morgue thing of dudes laying around and, you know, the power of the corpse, whatever the fuck. And you don't really care about planting this many corpses so meticulously, so annoyingly, to just try and make one item. Because it feels like it was kind of built as a thing that you kind of do a bit of RNG, and, you know, maybe you'd get something nice, maybe not. But if that was the case, it wouldn't have been so tedious and so hard to set up. So yes, I think it was kind of built as more of a casual system, but in the end, it had to be a sweaty, meticulous undertaking where you try and not fuck anything up so that you only get through this once. That was kind of the end result. It was a mechanic that you tried to engage with maybe a few times. As you know, speaking as probably one of the casuals of this sort of thing, you would engage with this a few times throughout the league, and you'd be glad when you're done with it, as opposed to, like, you know, excited that you did it. You'd be relieved that you finished your item, and you probably didn't want to make another item, anything like that, ever again. You had to get a lot of corpses, you had to get a lot of the exact thing that you need and then you probably had something like a 70 to 80% chance to get exactly what you wanted. And then if you failed, you basically just walked away and didn't want to do anything with it ever again. So that's a big problem as well. It generated some of the most powerful loot the game has ever seen. I see that as a problem too, because for game balance sake, one thing being so much better than everything else is just kind of wrong. But that aside, it generated some really powerful loot, and you needed to save up a lot of corpses and a lot of the right stuff and use a lot of your stash space. I don't know why this wasn't like inventoried better and, you know, sorted out better. You had to save up a lot of this stuff to make your one good chance, your one good attempt, and then finally get something out of it. Very delayed gratification, potentially very rewarding, but it doesn't matter how rewarding it is if it just fucking sucks to engage with, right? So then there's all that, right? Hopefully that covers some of the stuff. One other thing to do with the crafting is that kind of, I think, is a miss. It's an all or nothing system. You go all in on an item, you try and make something, you know, really nice, and if it works out, great, you've got the item you want. If it doesn't, nothing, zero. You've just wasted your time. As we've learned from past leagues and crafting systems, people do like incremental progress and upgrades. They like to be able to work on an item. You can look at the old harvest system that everyone absolutely loved and then tore down the fabric of Path of Exile over. It's an incremental system. You'd have an item, you'd work on it, you'd get some stuff, you'd maybe try again, upgrade it a bit. You maybe didn't get the right thing you needed, go get some more stuff, work on your item some more, eventually, potentially making your most powerful item. And it's incremental progress, and it feels like something you can keep engaging with and keep chasing for. With this, you save up for a few days for a corpse attempt or something, you try and make something, you whiff, and then you go, well, fuck that, I'm never doing that again. And then you're left without the pair of gloves that you wanted. So it's a bit of an all or nothing system, and the incremental progress feels a lot better with Harvest, feels a lot better with even Recombinators. A lot of the time you would get to keep at least a few of the modifiers that you wanted to keep on an item and then try and work on it again. So stuff like that, some of the more popular crafting systems in the past have at least potential for out and incremental progress, whereas this is an all or nothing system, and I think it kind of misses because of that. So I think I've mostly covered just about all the gripes about the system. Like, it can be very powerful. It generated some of the most powerful items the game's ever seen, I'd say, and it didn't feel particularly great to do. The stash thing is just crazy. Like, even with a quad tab, even with several tabs of my own, I would usually run out of space and usually not have enough of what I needed to craft with by myself, so I had to trade with other people. Many people bought way more tabs, and then especially if you're solo self-found, you had to just have a shitload of tabs and shitload of corpses. And the other issue with the corpses is the actual UI of like clicking them when you're fighting mobs. That was pretty scuffed too, which wears you down after a while. You know, a lot of the time you don't want to pick up some certain corpse, or it's not even a good one and you don't care about it at all, but there's like loot hidden behind it, and like clicking it's super annoying. So that was a pretty big issue as well. So that's, I think, more or less it for the league mechanic as far as I can kind of dissect. Hopefully I covered everything, and you saw some points of why maybe it's good or bad or burn some people out. The other thing for Necropolis League, though, is we were promised a bit of an end game reshuffle, and that is Uber bosses slightly rebalanced, nothing big there. But the big mistake they made here is saying the bridging gap between regular Guardian bosses and stuff and Ubers of tier 17s. So I say the big mistake is they called this a bridging gap when in reality it was an ass fucking, and it was like most of the time harder than Ubers themselves. If they didn't even call it a bridging gap, it may have just been its own side thing, right? Or if it was even shuffled the other way around, you did Ubers and then sometimes you got some tier 17s as a reward. It's like a big special fancy map. That could have made sense too. What we basically got is what we were hoping, you know, a big endgame little reshuffle and revamp and stuff. What we got is tier 17s, and they were really freaking hard. Once again, if you go back to day one and the way they were launched, what the fuck were they thinking? Like, some of these mods are absolutely fucking insane. And to begin with, you could not roll these maps you had all tier 17 mods on them, and that was it. That was your that was your entire avenue for getting to uber bosses. Like, even if you're rolling these right now for a strong build, let's say, you know, not an absolute S tier build, for a strong build, like some of my strongest builds, you would probably not want to run 20 to 30 of the things that you roll in a row. 20 to 30 of those chaos, you'd be like, I straight up probably cannot run those. And then finally you find some sort of compromise where you go, yeah, maybe I can run that. And then you die a few times with certain mods on there. That's how it is. Imagine you could not roll them, and imagine it was all tier 17 mods. You'd be picking up a fucking 100 of these things before you found one you could run on a pretty decent build. You'd need some of the best builds of the game to run most tier 17s just so you can have a sniff at some Ubers again. It actually, like, this is actually one of the things that pissed me off more than almost any other mechanic or introduction in a good long time in PoE, and it is tier 17s, because prior to this we had uber bosses. Yeah, they were challenging, they were accessible, and you could learn them, you could have a go at them, and most builds that I made could end up kind of overcoming them. Most builds I made could not overcome tier 17s unless I rolled them very meticulously and I did some cheese strats. And to top it all off, I had way less access to Ubers than ever before because of this system. I still ran a lot of tier 17s. I still tried to get through a lot of splinters. And to give you an example, my current grind here, I have 10 Uber Pinnacle bosses down. I had 85 Mavens killed, Uber Mavens killed, alone last league. Just Uber Mavens. Through getting Maven, putting some of my characters against it, something like that, right? I probably killed something like 150 Uber bosses in total last league, and this league I managed to get up to 10 by just doing my own fragments and doing my own tier 17s and stuff like that. It is so far away from what we had before that I don't know what the fuck just happened. So yeah, tier 17s were a huge issue, and it meant that a lot of us that were usually going kind of incrementally towards a big end game goal got kind of just brick walled at a certain point and couldn't progress any further. And then you were just either left trying to make a much better build that maybe you didn't want to play, or just quitting the league. Now, don't get me wrong, I still went through this. I still managed to do it. I was still played for like almost 2 full months and made 15 builds, and a lot of builds went through tier 17s and Ubers, but it didn't feel good, and it didn't feel like the old PoE system that I had, and that was pretty disappointing. I'm actually really curious to see what happens with 17s next league, 17s and Uber bosses, what kinds of changes they're going to bring to them, if any. If they're particularly good ones, I'll be very pleased. If they're nothing, yeah, I'll have stuff to say. If they're even worse, I'll have even more stuff to say. That's pretty much all I can say with that, and that's pretty much all I can talk about in Necropolis League, I think, for the most part. Yeah, build diversity is still pretty decent until you get to the absolute pinnacle of content in tier 17s. But otherwise, there's still a lot of fun, cool builds to do. Some really cool stuff came out of it. Tornado, you know, some skill gems, some cool loot, some pretty cool gameplay with the mapping and stuff. But at the end of the day, it was a league that kind of burnt a lot of people out, and for many various reasons. Hopefully that was some kind of insight into the league and how I may have thought about it. Still looking forward to the next league, see what happens. Like I said, very curious about the tier 17 thing. That is going to be the biggest make or break for me, most likely. Thank you very much for watching. See you guys next time.